The 16th of April 1945. In a basement beneath a bombed-out apartment building in Berlin's Pankow district. 15-year-old Hans Müller sat on a wooden crate, trying to stop his hands from shaking. Around him, 17 other boys ranging from 12 to 16 years old were receiving their final instructions from SS Hauptsturm fighter Werner Klein. Each boy had been issued a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, 3 stick grenades, and a piece of bread that was supposed to be their rations for the next 24 hours. Most of them had received less than 4 hours of training on how to use the Panzerfaust. None of them had ever fired one at an actual tank. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery was constant, a rolling barrage that shook dust from the ceiling and made the single light bulb swing on its cord. The Red Army was approximately 8 kilometers away, advancing through the eastern suburbs. Intelligence reports suggested they would reach this district within 48 hours, and standing between the largest mechanized army in human history and the heart of Berlin were boys who should have been in school, led by old men who should have been in retirement. This was the Volkssturm, Hitler's last desperate gamble, the people's militia. Except there were no people left, only children and grandfathers, armed with weapons designed for professional soldiers, and sent to face Soviet tanks that had crushed the Wehrmacht from Stalingrad to Warsaw. Hans looked at the Panzerfaust in his hands. It was essentially a disposable recoilless rifle designed to fire a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating tank armor. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. To use it effectively, you had to get within 30 meters of an enemy tank. You had one shot. If you missed, or if the tank had infantry support, you died. If you hit but the tank wasn't disabled, you died. If you successfully destroyed the tank but couldn't retreat fast enough, you died. The mathematics were brutal and obvious to anyone not consumed by Nazi ideology. But Hans and his friends weren't here by choice. They were here because refusing orders meant execution for desertion. They were here because the Hitler Youth had spent years preparing them for exactly this moment, teaching them that dying for the F-Fedra was the highest honor. They were here because their parents, if they were still alive, couldn't protect them from a regime that had decided children were acceptable casualties in a war that was already lost. Let me take you back 3 months to understand how Hans ended up in that basement. In January 1945, as Soviet forces crossed into German territory, Joseph Goebbels issued a decree for total mobilization. Every male between 16 and 60 capable of holding a weapon was to be conscripted into the Volkssturm. But the reality was that most men of fighting age were already dead, captured, or fighting on what remained of the front lines. So the age requirements were quietly ignored. Boys as young as 12 were inducted. Men in their 70s were given uniforms. Hans had been a member of the Hitler Youth since 1943, when membership became mandatory. The organization that had once been about camping trips and sporting competitions had transformed into a military training program. Boys learned to march, to shoot, to throw grenades, to identify enemy aircraft and tanks. They were taught that the Soviet soldiers were subhuman barbarians who would destroy Germany. They were shown propaganda films about heroic last stands and glorious deaths. They were never taught what a 14.5mm machine gun bullet does to a human body, or how it feels to watch your friends burn alive in a tank they couldn't destroy. The training Hans received for the Panzerfaust took exactly 3 hours and 40 minutes. An exhausted Wehrmacht sergeant demonstrated how to remove the safety, how to aim using the crude sight, how to account for the weapon's limited range. He showed them once how to position themselves to minimize backblast danger. Then each boy got to hold the weapon, practice aiming at an imaginary tank, and listen to the sergeant's warnings about making sure their shot counted because they wouldn't get a second one. What the sergeant didn't tell them, because he was under orders not to demoralize the troops, was that the Panzerfaust had been designed for trained infantry operating as part of combined arms teams. Professional soldiers would use the terrain for concealment, would coordinate with machine gun teams to suppress enemy infantry, would have squad members providing covering fire during retreat. Hans and his friends had none of this. They had improvised positions in rubble, strewn streets, no supporting weapons, and orders to hold their ground regardless of casualties. The 15th of April, the day before our story begins, Hans's unit had been moved into position in Pankow. Their fortifications consisted of a few sandbag positions, some overturned vehicles to use as obstacles, and the basement they were using as a command post. Their commanding officer, Hauptsturmfechter Klein, was 52 years old, had lost his left arm in World War I, and had spent the last 20 years as a postal clerk. He'd been given a rank in the SS Volkssturm 2 weeks ago. His military expertise consisted of memories from 1918 and a 2-day officer training course. Klein tried to be encouraging. He told the boys they were the last line of defense, that the Führer was counting on them, that their sacrifice would be remembered forever. He didn't tell them that German command had essentially written off this entire district. There were no reinforcements coming, no air support, no artillery support. They were a speed bump meant to delay Soviet advance by perhaps a few hours, while more important positions elsewhere were prepared. That night, Hans couldn't sleep. Neither could most of the other boys. They whispered in the darkness, trying to maintain the bravado that the Hitler Youth had drilled into them, but fear kept breaking through. 12-year-old Friedrich Weber, the youngest, quietly cried, until an older boy told him to shut up. Klaus Schneider, 16 and the oldest in the unit, tried to organize escape plans, suggesting they could desert under cover of darkness. But everyone knew the SS had roving patrols executing deserters. They'd all seen the bodies hanging from lampposts with signs reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the Reich." Some of the boys talked about their families. Hans's father had died at Kursk in 1943. His mother and younger sister had been evacuated from Berlin 3 weeks ago, though Hans had no idea where they'd gone or if they'd survived the journey. Klaus's entire family was still in Berlin, hiding in a basement somewhere in Kreuzberg. Friedrich's parents were dead, killed in a bombing raid. He'd been living in a Hitler Youth home for 6 months. These weren't soldiers. They were traumatized children who'd been handed weapons and pointed at the enemy. They were casualties before the first shot was even fired. The 16th of April began at 3 a.m. with the Soviet preliminary barrage. The artillery bombardment was unlike anything Hans had imagined possible. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead in waves, exploding across the district with sequential detonations that sounded like the world ending. Heavy artillery shells, 152mm rounds, created blast waves that collapsed buildings 3 blocks away. The basement shook so violently that part of the ceiling caved in, killing 2 boys instantly under falling concrete. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural, broken only by the ringing in everyone's ears and the moans of wounded boys. Klein did a quick count. They'd lost 4 boys to the bombardment, 3 more were too wounded to fight. That left 14 combat, effective soldiers, 14 children with Panzerfausts to stop a Soviet tank column. At 5 a.m., the scouts reported movement. Soviet infantry, advancing in company strength, supported by at least 6 T-34 tanks. The tanks moved slowly, cautiously, their crews aware they were entering urban terrain, where Panzerfaust teams could be hiding anywhere. Their caution was well-founded, but it wouldn't save Hans and his friends. Klein positioned the boys according to their training. Hans and Klaus were assigned to a position in a bombed outshop approximately 40 meters from the main street where the tanks would pass. 2 other boys, Martin Braun and Otto Schmidt, both 15, were in a building across the street. The plan, such as it was, involved waiting until the tanks were parallel to their positions, then firing simultaneously to maximize casualties before the Soviet infantry could react. Here is what actually happened. The first T-34 appeared around the corner at 5:47 a.m. It was massive, far larger than Hans had imagined from the training diagrams. The engine roar was deafening. The cannon traversed slowly, searching for threats. Behind it came Soviet infantry, experienced soldiers who'd fought from Moscow to Berlin, moving in tactical formation with weapons ready. Martin Braun panicked. He was supposed to wait for Klein's signal, but seeing the tank triggered every fear he'd been suppressing. He rose from his position, aimed his Panzerfaust, and fired from 60 meters away, twice the weapon's effective range. The warhead detonated harmlessly against the tank's front armor, leaving a scorch mark but no penetration. The tank's turret spun toward Martin's position with terrifying speed. The coaxial machine gun opened fire, 7.62 millimeters, rounds punching through the thin walls of Martin's position. He was dead before he could reload, not that he had a second Panzerfaust anyway. The sound of the machine gun triggered chaos. Another boy, Peter Hoffmann, 14 years old, broke from his position and ran. He made it perhaps 10 meters before an SVT-40 rifle round from a Soviet infantryman caught him in the back. He fell face first into rubble and didn't move. Hans watched this unfold in the space of perhaps 15 seconds. His brain couldn't process the speed at which everything was going wrong. The careful plan, the positioning, the coordination, all of it evaporated the moment. Real combat began. And now the Soviets knew they were facing resistance. The tanks had stopped advancing and were traversing their turrets, searching for targets. The infantry had taken cover and were preparing to clear the buildings systematically. Klaus grabbed Hans's shoulder. "We have to fire now before they spot us." His voice was shaking, but he was right. They had perhaps 30 seconds before Soviet infantry would sweep their building. Hans looked at the nearest tank, a T-34-85, approximately 35 meters away. It was a viable shot, barely. They rose together. Hans sighted on the tank's side armor, the thinner plate behind the track assembly. His finger found the trigger. He squeezed. The Panzerfaust roared, the back blast filling the room with smoke and noise. Through the haze, Hans saw the warhead strike home. The shaped charge penetrated the T-34's armor, creating a jet of superheated metal that turned the tank's interior into a death trap. The tank stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. For perhaps 2 seconds, Hans felt triumph. He'd actually done it. He'd killed a Soviet tank. Then reality reasserted itself. Klaus had fired simultaneously at a different tank but missed, the warhead detonating against rubble. Now they had no weapons except stick grenades, and the entire Soviet force knew exactly where they were. The building's wall exploded inward as another T-34 fired its 85mm main gun at point-blank range. The high-explosive shell detonated inside the room. Klaus was vaporized instantly. Hans was thrown backward through a doorway by the blast wave, his ears bleeding, temporarily deaf and blind from overpressure. When his vision cleared, perhaps 20 seconds later, he was lying in a corridor filled with dust and smoke. Part of the ceiling had collapsed. He could see daylight through holes in the walls. His uniform was torn, and he was bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds, though adrenaline prevented him from feeling pain yet. He tried to stand and discovered his right leg wasn't responding properly. Looking down, he saw a piece of metal protruding from his thigh, blood spreading across his trousers. Soviet voices, shouting in Russian. The infantry had reached his building. Hans dragged himself into a corner and tried to make himself invisible, knowing it was futile. He had one stick grenade left on his belt, but his hands wouldn't cooperate to unsling it. He thought about his mother and sister, wondered if they were safe, hoped they would never know how he died. A Soviet soldier appeared in the doorway, PPSH-41 submachine gun raised. He was young, perhaps 25, with a dirt-streaked face and exhausted eyes. He and Hans locked gazes for a moment that stretched impossibly long. The soldier saw a bleeding child in a too large uniform, clearly no longer a threat. Hans saw a soldier who'd probably been fighting for years, who'd seen things no human should witness, who was now confronted with shooting a wounded teenager. The soldier lowered his weapon. He said something in Russian that Hans didn't understand, but the tone seemed almost apologetic. Then he moved on, clearing the rest of the building. Hans heard more gunfire, more shouting, then silence. Over the next hour, as shock began to set in, Hans drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, Soviet medics found him. They applied a tourniquet to his leg, gave him water, and carried him to a collection point where other wounded were being triaged. He was one of 3 boys from his unit who survived. 14 had died. For what? To delay the Soviet advance by approximately 40 minutes. The battle for Berlin would continue for another 2 weeks. The Volkssturm units, these makeshift armies of children and old men, would be systematically destroyed. Thousands of boys like Hans would die in pointless last stands, victims not of Soviet brutality but of Nazi ideology that had decided their lives were expendable in service of a regime that was already defeated. Hans would survive his wounds, spend 3 months in Soviet custody, then be released when he could prove he'd been conscripted against his will. He would live the rest of his life with a pronounced limp and nightmares about the sound of tank engines. He would never speak about the 16th of April 1945, except once decades later, to a historian researching the Volkssturm. In that interview, Hans said something that captures the obscenity of what happened. They gave us weapons designed for soldiers and told us we were heroes. But we weren't soldiers, we were children. And they murdered us just as surely as if they'd put bullets in our heads themselves. The only difference was that this way they could call it honorable. The Hitler Youth's last stand wasn't heroic, it wasn't glorious, it wasn't even militarily significant. It was child sacrifice on an industrial scale, the final crime of a regime that had never cared about the lives it destroyed in pursuit of power. Boys who should have been learning trigonometry were instead learning how to die, and the adults who sent them into battle called it patriotism. The 16th of April, 1945, was one of thousands of such days in Berlin's final agony, but it represents something important about the nature of the Nazi regime's collapse. When faced with inevitable defeat, they didn't surrender to spare civilian lives. They didn't seek terms to minimize suffering. Instead, they fed their own children into the meat grinder, convinced that sacrifice was more important than survival, that dying for the Führer was preferable to living in a world where Germany had lost. The boys of the Volkssturm were victims twice over. First, they were victims of the Nazi regime that conscripted, indoctrinated, and ultimately sacrificed them. Second, they became victims of historical memory, often forgotten in narratives about the war's end that focus on the larger strategic picture. But their deaths weren't strategic. They were murder disguised as military necessity. Hans Müller lived until 1998. At his funeral, his daughter found a small box he'd kept hidden for decades. Inside was his Hitler Youth dagger, the knife he'd been so proud of when he received it at age 13. The blade had been broken in half. Hans had apparently snapped it shortly after returning from Soviet captivity. On a piece of paper in the box, written in Hans's handwriting, was a single sentence: for Klaus, Friedrich, Martin, Otto, and the others. They deserved better than us. They did deserve better. They deserved adults who would protect them rather than sacrifice them. They deserved a government that valued children's lives over ideological purity. They deserved to grow old, to have families, to live in peace. Instead, they got Panzerfausts and orders to die for a 1,000-year Reich that collapsed around them. The 16th of April 1945 wasn't just the day German teenagers were sent to die for Berlin. It was the day the Nazi regime's complete moral bankruptcy became undeniable. When your last military strategy involves arming children and sending them against tanks, you've already lost everything that matters. The war was over. All that remained was counting the unnecessary dead.